A desperate mother begs for work to feed her child. The town mocks her weakness until her 4-year-old son sees the rancher and cries out the one word that changes everything. Some secrets can't stay buried when love refuses to be silent. Margaret Hayes clutched her son closer as the laughter erupted around them. The sound cut through the morning air like shattered glass, sharp and merciless. She stood in the middle of Millfield's Main Street, her patched dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her boy Tommy pressed against her side with his face buried in her worn shawl. The men lounging outside Brennan's saloon pointed and whispered, their voices carrying cruel amusement that made her cheeks burn with shame. But shame was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Not when Tommy hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Not when the last of their flour had run out yesterday morning. "Please," she said again, her voice steadier now despite the trembling in her hands. She looked directly at Jake Morrison, the bank manager who'd foreclosed on her late husband's shop just 2 months ago. "I can clean, I can cook, I can mend, anything you need, just enough to feed my boy." Jake's perfectly waxed mustache twitched with barely contained laughter. His round belly strained against his vest as he rocked back on his heels, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Now, Margaret, we've been through this before. A woman in your condition has no business working. You should be looking for another husband, not embarrassing yourself in the street." The other men chuckled their approval, nodding their heads like puppets on strings. Margaret's jaw clenched. Her condition, as if being a widow was some sort of disease that rendered her incapable of honest work. As if loving her husband and losing him had somehow stolen her ability to contribute anything meaningful to the world. She'd heard it all before, these condescending words wrapped in false concern, but today they stung differently. Today they felt like barriers between her child and his next meal. "I don't want charity," she said, lifting her chin despite the heat creeping up her neck. "I want to work. I want to earn what we need." This brought fresh waves of laughter from the growing crowd. Even Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store had emerged to watch, her arms crossed and her lips pursed in that particular expression of judgment that seemed to be the town's specialty. Margaret had once been part of their circle, back when her husband Robert was alive and their little shop had been thriving. Back when she wore silk dresses to Sunday service and hosted tea parties for the other merchant wives. Now she was entertainment, a fallen woman whose desperation provided their morning's amusement. Tommy shifted against her side and she felt him trembling, not from cold but from hunger. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. Her 4-year-old son was shaking with weakness while these people laughed at her attempts to provide for him. The rage that flared in her chest was so sudden and fierce that she almost gasped aloud. But she swallowed it down, forced it into that place where she kept all the other feelings she couldn't afford to indulge. Anger wouldn't feed Tommy. Pride wouldn't put a roof over their heads. "Surely someone needs help," she pressed, her voice growing desperate now despite her best efforts. "Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned last month that you needed someone to help with inventory." "That was before," Mrs. Patterson interrupted, her tone clipped. "Things have changed, Margaret. You must understand, we have reputations to consider. Having a woman of your circumstances working in our establishments, well, it simply wouldn't be proper." A woman of her circumstances. Margaret wanted to scream. Her circumstances were that her husband had died of fever, that the debts from his medical care had consumed everything they owned, that she was trying desperately to keep her child alive in a world that seemed determined to watch them both starve. But apparently, these circumstances made her unsuitable for honest work. Apparently, these circumstances made her a source of shame rather than sympathy. The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the commotion like vultures to carrion. Margaret recognized most of the faces, people who had once smiled at her, who had bought goods from Robert's shop, who had praised her pies at church socials. Now they watched her desperation with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for public executions. She was their morning entertainment, their cautionary tale, their reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Just as Margaret was about to turn away, to retreat back to the tiny room she could barely afford above Murphy's boarding house, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the crowd's murmur. Everyone turned to look as a rider approached, a man on a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dance rather than merely walk. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the quality of his clothes, the easy confidence in his posture, the way the morning sun seemed to catch the silver details on his saddle and bridle. Thomas Blackwood. The name rippled through the crowd like a whispered prayer. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him, taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples. He'd been gone for 5 years, managing his family's interests in San Francisco, and his return had been the subject of endless speculation for weeks. The Blackwood Ranch was the largest in the territory, employing dozens of men and supporting half the businesses in town. Thomas Blackwood was royalty, in a place that pretended not to believe in such things. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the dusty street with barely a sound. The crowd parted before him like water, their earlier amusement forgotten in the presence of real power. Margaret found herself frozen in place, caught between the desperate need to flee and the terrible hope that maybe, just maybe, this man might be different. That maybe someone with real influence might see past her circumstances to her willingness to work. Thomas approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in the scene with quiet assessment. He nodded politely to the assembled townsfolk, his expression neutral but somehow commanding. When his gaze finally settled on Margaret, she felt a jolt of recognition so strong it nearly knocked her off balance. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. Something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with hope for employment. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, warm, with just a hint of the educated accent he'd acquired during his years back east. "I heard you were looking for work." The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. Margaret could feel their collective shock that Thomas Blackwood would even acknowledge her existence, let alone engage her in conversation. She straightened her shoulders, acutely aware of how shabby she must look compared to his impeccable appearance. "Yes, sir," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I can do most anything: cleaning, cooking, mending. I'm a hard worker." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Margaret felt the weight of the crowd's attention, the pressure of this moment that could change everything or leave her more humiliated than before. Tommy pressed closer against her side, sensing the tension in the air even if he didn't understand its source. "My housekeeper recently left to care for her ailing mother," Thomas said finally. "The position pays well, room and board included plus wages, but it's demanding work. Long hours, high standards. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret's heart leaped so violently she was sure everyone could see it hammering against her ribs. Room and board, wages. It sounded too good to be true, too generous, too perfect. Behind Thomas, she could see Jake Morrison's face turning an alarming shade of purple, his earlier amusement replaced by something that looked suspiciously like rage. "Yes," she breathed, then stronger. "Yes, sir. I can do whatever needs doing. I won't disappoint you." Thomas nodded once decisively. "Then it's settled. You can start tomorrow morning, be at the ranch house by 6. He turned to go, then paused, his attention shifting to Tommy for the first time. The little boy had been hiding behind his mother's skirts, overwhelmed by the crowd and the strange adult conversation, but something about Thomas made him peek out curiously. The moment their eyes met, Tommy's face transformed. His mouth fell open, his eyes went wide with wonder and disbelief, and he took a stumbling step forward as if pulled by invisible strings. "Papa!" The word exploded from him like a sob, like a prayer, like the answer to every question he'd never been allowed to ask. "Papa, you came back." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face so quickly that the world tilted sideways. Around them, the crowd drew in a collective breath, their shock palpable. Thomas Blackwood stood frozen, his composed mask slipping for just an instant to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. Tommy broke free from his mother's grip and ran toward Thomas with his arms outstretched, tears streaming down his thin cheeks. "Papa, Papa, I knew you'd come back. I told Mama you would." Margaret lunged forward to catch him, her face burning with horror and shame, but she was too late. Tommy crashed into Thomas's legs, wrapping his small arms around the man's knees with desperate strength. "Tommy, no," Margaret gasped, her voice breaking. "Come back here right now." But Thomas wasn't pushing the child away. Instead, his hands hovered uncertainly over Tommy's dark head, his face a battleground of emotions too complex to name. The resemblance between them was suddenly, devastatingly obvious. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, the same deep brown eyes that seemed to see too much. The crowd erupted into whispers, gasps, and barely contained exclamations. Margaret could hear the scandal spreading like wildfire, could feel the weight of their judgment crashing down on her like an avalanche. Her legs threatened to give out beneath her as the full magnitude of what had just happened sank in. Her secret, the secret she'd guarded with her life, the secret that had cost her everything, was now laid bare in the middle of Main Street for everyone to see. Thomas Blackwood's hands finally settled on Tommy's shoulders, and Margaret watched in horror as the man she tried so desperately to forget knelt down to meet her son's eyes. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, more vicious. She could hear fragments of their shock and condemnation floating through the air like poison. "Always wondered about that boy. Explains why she never remarried. The scandal of it all." Her chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped iron bands around her ribs and was slowly tightening them until she couldn't breathe. "Tommy," Thomas said softly, his voice rough with an emotion Margaret couldn't identify. What makes you think I'm your papa?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Of course he would ask. Of course he would want to understand how a 4-year-old child could recognize a father he'd supposedly never met. Tommy's face scrunched up in confusion, as if the answer should be obvious to any thinking person. "Mama has your picture," Tommy said matter-of-factly, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "She keeps it in the special box under her bed. She looks at it when she thinks I'm sleeping, and sometimes she cries." The crowd's gasps were audible now, and Margaret felt her knees buckle. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, finding only empty air. Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath cut through the morning like a blade, and Jake Morrison's face had progressed from purple to an alarming shade of red that suggested imminent apoplexy. Thomas's eyes found Margaret's across the small space that separated them, and the look that passed between them was electric with years of unspoken words, buried feelings, and carefully guarded secrets. She saw recognition there and something that might have been longing, but also confusion and a growing storm of questions that she knew she couldn't answer. Not here, not in front of half the town, not when her child's future hung in the balance. "Mrs. Hayes," Thomas said, rising slowly to his feet but keeping one protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." His voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the tremor underneath. She could see the way his jaw tensed, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. He was struggling to maintain his composure just as much as she was, and somehow that knowledge made everything worse. "There's nothing to discuss," Margaret said quickly, her voice pitched higher than normal. She stepped forward and reached for Tommy, who looked between her and Thomas with growing confusion. "Tommy, come here right now. You've made a mistake, sweetheart. This gentleman he's not." But the words died in her throat because how could she lie to her son's face? How could she deny what was written so clearly in their matching features, their identical stubborn chins, their shared way of tilting their heads when they were thinking? "But Mama," Tommy protested, his small hand finding Thomas's and holding tight. "He looks just like the picture. And you said Papa was the most handsome man in the whole territory, and he is. Look at him." The innocent pride in her son's voice nearly broke Margaret's heart. Tommy had constructed an entire mythology around the father he'd never known, built from scraps of stories she'd told him, and the single photograph she'd thought was safely hidden. Now that mythology was colliding with reality in the most public, most devastating way possible. The crowd was no longer pretending to give them space. People pressed in from all sides, their faces bright with curiosity and malicious excitement. Margaret could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they were already composing the stories they would tell, the gossip they would spread. By nightfall, every person in 3 counties would know that the starving widow Margaret Hayes had been carrying Thomas Blackwood's bastard child. By tomorrow, the scandal would have reached the territorial capital. "Mr. Blackwood," Jake Morrison stepped forward, his voice oily with false concern. "Surely you don't mean to let this woman's accusations stand unchallenged. The implications for your reputation, your family's good name." "I haven't made any accusations," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with desperation. "My son is confused, that's all. He's just a child who's heard stories and—" But Thomas was shaking his head slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "No," he said quietly, "he's not confused." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet, felt 5 years of carefully constructed lies crumble into dust. Thomas looked down at Tommy, who was beaming up at him with pure, uncomplicated joy, and something in the man's expression softened. "Hello, son," he said, and his voice broke just a little on the word. Tommy launched himself forward again, wrapping his arms around Thomas's waist with fierce determination. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice muffled against Thomas's vest. "Mama said you went away on important business, but I knew you'd remember about us someday." Margaret wanted to die. Right there, in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by the ruins of her reputation and her carefully guarded secrets, she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. The crowd erupted into chaos. Voices rose in excitement, shock, and condemnation. Mrs. Patterson was fanning herself dramatically while demanding to know how long Margaret had been deceiving the good people of Millfield. Jake Morrison was pontificating about moral decay and the corruption of proper society. Other voices joined in, creating a cacophony of judgment that made Margaret's head spin. But through it all, Thomas stood perfectly still, his arms now wrapped protectively around Tommy, his eyes locked on Margaret's face. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority. "Privately. Now." Margaret nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. She felt as if she were drowning, as if the weight of 5 years of secrets and sacrifice was finally pulling her under. "Come," Thomas said, lifting Tommy into his arms with easy strength. The boy settled against his father's chest as if he belonged there, as if those arms had been waiting for him all his life. "We'll go to the ranch, all of us." He turned to address the crowd, his voice taking on the tone of command that came so naturally to men of his class and position. "This is a private family matter. I trust everyone here has better things to do than stand around gossiping like old women." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, clearly disappointed to be dismissed just when things were getting interesting. But no one dared argue with Thomas Blackwood directly. He had too much power, employed too many of their husbands and sons, held too many mortgages and debts. They would gossip later in the safety of their homes and shops, but they wouldn't challenge him to his face. Margaret walked beside Thomas as they moved toward his horse, acutely aware of every eye that followed them, every whisper that trailed in their wake. Tommy chattered happily from his perch in Thomas's arms, pointing out things he remembered from the stories his mother had told him, asking endless questions about the ranch and the horses, and whether his papa had missed him very much. "Did you know about me?" Tommy asked suddenly, his small hand resting on Thomas's cheek. "Did you know you had a little boy?" Thomas's step faltered slightly, and Margaret saw his jaw clench. "No," he said honestly, "I didn't know." Tommy considered this with the serious expression he wore when wrestling with complicated adult concepts. "That's okay," he said finally. "You know now, that's what matters." The simple forgiveness in her son's voice brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Tommy had inherited more than just Thomas's features. He had his father's generous heart, his capacity for understanding and acceptance. It was a trait that would serve him well in a world that had already proven itself capable of cruelty. They reached Thomas's horse, and he set Tommy down gently before turning to face Margaret fully for the first time since the revelation. Up close, she could see the changes 5 years had wrought, new lines around his eyes, a weariness in his expression that spoke of responsibilities and losses she could only imagine. But he was still devastatingly handsome, still the man who had swept her off her feet during those stolen weeks when he'd courted her in secret. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and the quiet pain in his voice made her chest ache. "Why didn't you send word? I had a right to know I had a son." Margaret looked down at Tommy, who was examining Thomas's boots with intense concentration, then back up at the man she'd loved and lost and never stopped thinking about. How could she explain 5 years of reasoning in the middle of Main Street? How could she make him understand the impossible choice she'd been forced to make? "You were engaged," she said simply, "to Virginia Carmichael. The wedding announcement was in the San Francisco papers. I saw it myself." Thomas's face went pale and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "Margaret, no," she interrupted, shaking her head. "You don't have to explain. I understood. You were from one world, I was from another. What we had it was beautiful, but it wasn't real. Not really. I couldn't trap you with news of a child. I couldn't be the scandal that destroyed your future." The silence stretched between them, heavy with regret and unspoken words. Tommy looked up from his examination of Thomas's boots, sensing the tension even if he didn't understand its source. "Are we going to see the horses now?" he asked hopefully. "Mama said you have the most beautiful horses in the whole territory." Thomas smiled down at his son, and Margaret's heart clenched at the tenderness in his expression. "Yes," he said, "we're going to see the horses. And I think it's time your mama and I had a very long talk." The Blackwood Ranch house rose from the valley like something out of a dream, all white columns and wraparound porches that seemed to stretch for miles. Margaret had imagined this place countless times during those long, lonely nights when Tommy asked about his father's home, but her imagination had fallen short of the reality. The house spoke of generations of wealth and power, of a family that had carved their name into the very landscape of the territory. As their wagon approached the circular drive, Margaret felt the weight of her shabby dress and worn shoes more acutely than ever. Tommy pressed his face against the wagon side, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in the sprawling stables, the manicured gardens, the fountain that sparkled in the afternoon sun. "Is this really where my papa lives?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the magical vision disappear. Thomas, who had ridden alongside their wagon on his stallion, dismounted and came to help them down. His hands were gentle but impersonal as he lifted Tommy, and Margaret felt the careful distance he was maintaining between them like a physical barrier. "Welcome home," Thomas said to Tommy, and the words carried a weight that made Margaret's throat tighten. This was Tommy's birthright, this grandeur and beauty that she had kept from him for 4 years. This was the life he should have known, the security and comfort that every mother dreamed of providing for her child. Instead, she had given him uncertainty, hunger, and the shame of being a bastard in a world that had no tolerance for such things. Rosa Martinez appeared on the front porch, her dark eyes bright with curiosity as she wiped her hands on her apron. She had been the Blackwood family's housekeeper for more than 20 years, and Margaret knew that nothing happened on this ranch without her knowledge and approval. Rosa's gaze moved from Thomas to Margaret to Tommy, and Margaret saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in the older woman's face. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Rosa," Thomas called, his voice carefully neutral. "This is Mrs. Hayes and her son Tommy. They'll be staying with us for a while." Rosa nodded once, her expression giving nothing away. "The blue room is ready," she said, as if she had been expecting them all along. "And the boy, he'll need the small room next to it, yes." The casual way she accepted their presence, as if taking in desperate widows and their children was a regular occurrence, made Margaret's eyes burn with unexpected tears. Tommy had wandered away from the adults, drawn by the sound of horses in the nearby corral. Margaret watched him press his small face between the fence rails, his whole body vibrating with excitement as the animals approached to investigate this new visitor. One horse, a gentle bay mare, lowered her head to sniff at Tommy's outstretched hand, and the boy's delighted giggle carried across the yard like music. "He's never seen horses up close," Margaret said softly, not sure why she felt compelled to explain. "We lived above the boarding house in town, no room for animals." Thomas followed her gaze to where their son was attempting to climb the fence for a better view. "He's not afraid," Thomas observed, and there was pride in his voice. "That's good. Fear and horses don't mix well." Margaret wanted to tell him that Tommy wasn't afraid of anything, that her son approached the world with a fearless curiosity that both thrilled and terrified her. She wanted to share 4 years' worth of stories, Tommy's first words, his first steps, the way he laughed in his sleep and asked endless questions about everything he encountered. But the careful politeness in Thomas's manner warned her against such intimacies. He was being kind because Tommy was his son, but that kindness didn't extend to her. She was the woman who had kept his child from him, and forgiveness for that transgression would not come easily. "Mrs. Hayes," Rosa appeared at Margaret's elbow, her voice warm but businesslike. "Come, I show you to your room. The boy, he can stay outside with his papa for now, yes." The word papa hung in the air between them, acknowledging the relationship that could no longer be denied. Margaret nodded gratefully and followed Rosa into the house, acutely aware of the luxury that surrounded her at every turn. The blue room was larger than the entire space she and Tommy had been sharing above Murphy's boarding house. Sunlight streamed through tall windows draped in silk, illuminating furniture that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. A connecting door led to a smaller room where a narrow bed had been made up with quilts and pillows that looked softer than clouds. Tommy's room. A place where her son could sleep without hunger gnawing at his belly, without the constant fear of eviction hanging over their heads. "Is hard, no," Rosa said quietly, settling into a chair by the window. "To come back to a place that holds so many memories." Margaret looked at the older woman sharply, surprised by the knowing tone in her voice. Rosa smiled sadly. "You think I don't remember you? The young woman who used to meet Mr. Thomas by the old oak tree when he thought no one was watching. Love leaves marks, Mija, even when we try to hide them." The admission hung between them like a confession. Margaret sank into a chair across from Rosa, suddenly exhausted by the weight of secrets that were no longer secret. "You knew," she said simply. "All this time you knew." Rosa nodded, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap. "I suspected when you disappeared so suddenly. I knew for certain when I saw the boy today. He has the Blackwood eyes, that one, strong and stubborn just like his papa." Margaret felt tears threatening again and fought them back with the same determination that had carried her through 5 years of struggle. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "Thomas was supposed to marry Virginia Carmichael. The wedding was planned, the announcement sent. I couldn't destroy his future for my mistake." Rosa's expression softened further, and she reached across to pat Margaret's hand with maternal gentleness. "Was no mistake, Mija. Was love. Sometimes love makes us do things that seem impossible to understand, but the heart knows its own truth." Rosa stood and moved to the window, where they could see Thomas teaching Tommy how to properly approach a horse. The sight of father and son together, dark heads bent close as they shared this moment of connection, made Margaret's chest ache with a mixture of joy and regret so intense she could barely breathe. "He never married her," Rosa said softly, still watching the scene in the corral. "Virginia Carmichael. The engagement was broken just 2 weeks before the wedding. She ran away with a cavalry officer, younger, more romantic, not so burdened with family responsibilities. Mr. Thomas, he was devastated. Not because he loved her, I think, but because he had finally accepted that duty would be his only companion in marriage. When she left, he threw himself into business, traveled constantly, built walls around his heart that no one could breach." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Thomas had never married, had never found the conventional happiness that she had sacrificed their love to ensure. All these years, she had comforted herself with the belief that her choice had been necessary, that Thomas was better off without the scandal of a bastard child destroying his carefully planned future. But he had remained alone, carrying his own burden of loss and regret. "I should have written," Margaret said, the words torn from her throat. "I should have told him about Tommy." Rosa turned from the window, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Perhaps," she said gently, "but you did what you thought was right with the information you had. Now you have a chance to make things right. Not the same as they were, that time is gone, but right for the future. Right for the boy. Through the window, Margaret watched as Thomas lifted Tommy onto the back of the gentle mare, keeping a steadying hand on the child's back as the horse walked slowly around the corral. Tommy's face was radiant with joy, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with determined concentration. He looked completely natural on horseback, as if he had been born to it, as if this was where he belonged. "He's going to want to claim him," Margaret said, voicing her deepest fear. Thomas is going to want to claim him as his heir, give him the Blackwood name, raise him as a proper son." Rosa nodded slowly, understanding the implications immediately. "And you are afraid he will not want the mother to come with the son." The words hung heavy in the air, cutting straight to the heart of Margaret's terror. Margaret had spent 4 years being everything to Tommy: mother, father, protector, provider. She had sacrificed everything to keep him safe and fed and loved. The thought of losing him to a world of privilege that she could never be part of was like contemplating her own death. But how could she deny her son the security and advantages that his father could provide? How could she let her own fears stand in the way of Tommy's happiness? "I won't fight him," Margaret said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "If Thomas wants to acknowledge Tommy, to give him his name and his place in the world, I won't stand in the way. Tommy deserves better than what I can give him." Rosa's sharp intake of breath made Margaret look up, surprised by the anger she saw flashing in the older woman's dark eyes. "You foolish girl," Rosa said, her voice crackling with indignation. "You think love is something that can be replaced by money and fine clothes. You think a boy needs mansions more than he needs his mama's arms." She moved to Margaret's chair and gripped her shoulders firmly. "That child out there, he has been loved every day of his life. Loved completely, sacrificially, the way children should be loved. You think Mr. Thomas doesn't see that? You think he doesn't understand what kind of mother raises a son like Tommy?" Margaret wanted to believe Rosa's words, wanted to hope that her love would be enough to secure her place in Tommy's future, but she had learned not to trust in hope. Hope was a luxury that starving widows couldn't afford. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment was a wound that never quite healed. The sound of approaching footsteps made both women turn toward the door. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed from the wind, his shirt sleeves rolled up from working with the horses. Behind him, Tommy bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement. "Mama, Mama, did you see me riding? Papa says I'm a natural. He says maybe tomorrow he'll teach me to use a rope." The easy way Tommy said "Papa" made Margaret's heart clench, but she forced a smile. "I saw, sweetheart. You looked very brave up there." Tommy beamed and launched into a detailed account of his equestrian adventure, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Thomas watched his son with an expression that Margaret couldn't quite read, wonder perhaps, mixed with something that looked like pain. "We need to talk," Thomas said quietly when Tommy finally paused for breath. "About arrangements, about the future." Margaret nodded, knowing this conversation had been inevitable from the moment Tommy had called out "Papa" in the middle of Main Street. The time for secrets and avoidance was over. Now came the harder part, deciding how to build a future from the wreckage of the past. "Tommy," Rosa said, extending her hand to the boy, "come with me to the kitchen. I think there might be fresh cookies that need tasting." Tommy looked between his parents, sensing the gravity of the moment even if he didn't understand its implications. "Will you tell me about the cookies later, Mama?" he asked, and Margaret's heart broke a little at the trust in his voice. "Of course, sweetheart. Go with Rosa now." Margaret watched her son leave hand in hand with the housekeeper, and then she was alone with Thomas for the first time in 5 years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice carefully controlled but tinged with an emotion that might have been pain. "He calls me Papa," Thomas said, and Margaret heard the wonder and confusion in his voice. "How does he know to call me that? What have you told him about me?" Margaret met his eyes, seeing her own reflection in their dark depths. This was the moment of truth, the conversation that would determine not just her future, but Tommy's as well. Everything depended on her honesty now, on her ability to make Thomas understand the choices she had made and why she had made them. Margaret took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she faced the question she had dreaded for 4 years. "I told him his papa was the bravest, most honorable man I'd ever known," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told him you had to go away on important business, but that you loved him very much even though you couldn't be with him. I told him," her voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself. "I told him that someday, when he was older, he might get to meet you." Thomas's face went white, and he gripped the back of a chair so hard his knuckles stood out like marble. "You made me into a hero," he said, and there was something like anguish in his voice. "All these years, you've been telling him stories about a father who chose to leave him, and you made me into a hero." The accusation hung between them like a blade, cutting deep into wounds that had never properly healed. "What was I supposed to tell him?" Margaret's composure finally cracked, and the words poured out in a rush of pain and desperation. "That his father didn't want him, that I was just a shopkeeper's daughter who wasn't good enough for the great Thomas Blackwood, that I was something you experimented with before settling down with someone appropriate." Her voice rose with each word, 5 years of suppressed hurt and anger finally finding voice. "That's not," Thomas started, but Margaret wasn't finished. She had held these words inside for too long, and now they demanded to be spoken. "I could have told him the truth, Thomas. I could have told him that his father promised to love me forever and then disappeared to San Francisco to marry someone else without so much as a goodbye. I could have told him that love is just a pretty lie people tell when they want something, and that honor is just a word rich men use when they're discarding inconvenient women." Thomas flinched as if she had struck him, but Margaret pressed on relentlessly. "Instead, I told him his father was a good man who had important responsibilities. I told him that sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices, but that doesn't mean they stop loving their children. I told him that his papa would be proud of him for being brave and kind and smart." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she made no effort to wipe them away. "I gave him a father he could admire instead of a father he could hate. And you want to know why? Because I loved you too much to let our son grow up bitter." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood frozen by the chair, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Margaret could see the war being fought behind his eyes, pain, guilt, regret, and something that might have been grief for all the lost years between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I never got your letter," he said quietly. "If you had writ to tell me about Tommy, I never received it." Margaret stared at him, confused by the statement. "I didn't write," she said slowly. "I told you I saw the engagement announcement. I knew you were getting married." Thomas shook his head, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she remembered from their stolen moments together. "I wrote to you," he said, and the words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "When I got back to San Francisco, I wrote to you every week for months. I told you about the business meetings, about how much I missed you, about the plans I was making to come back to Millfield. I told you," his voice broke, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "I told you I loved you and that I was going to break my engagement to Virginia. I told you I didn't care what society thought, that I wanted to marry you regardless of the consequences." Margaret felt the room spin around her, felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the foundation of everything she thought she knew crumbled into dust. "I never got any letters," she whispered. "I waited for months, but you never wrote. And then I saw the engagement announcement in the paper, and I thought I knew that you had moved on, that what we had meant nothing to you." Thomas was staring at her with an expression of dawning horror. "Someone intercepted them," he said slowly. "Someone made sure you never received my letters, made sure I never received yours. Someone wanted us to believe that we had abandoned each other." The implications hit them both at the same time, and Margaret saw her own realization reflected in Thomas's eyes. "Who?" she breathed, but even as she asked the question, she was remembering things, little details that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on sinister meaning. Jake Morrison's satisfaction when she had been forced to sell Robert's shop. Mrs. Patterson's cruel pleasure in Margaret's fall from grace. The way the whole town had seemed to close ranks against her after Thomas left for San Francisco. Someone who benefited from keeping us apart, Thomas said grimly. Someone who wanted to make sure the Blackwood heir didn't marry beneath his station. His jaw clenched with barely controlled fury. Someone who thought they knew better than I did about who I should love. Margaret thought about the 5 years of struggle, the nights when she had gone to bed hungry so Tommy could eat, the humiliation of begging for work from people who had once been her friends. All of it could have been avoided if not for someone's interference. It doesn't matter now, she said, though her voice shook with the magnitude of the betrayal. What's done is done. We can't change the past. But Thomas was shaking his head vehemently. It matters, he said fiercely. It matters because someone stole 5 years from us. Someone made you believe I had abandoned you, made me believe you didn't want me anymore. Someone kept me from knowing my son. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the hallway. Tommy burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement, and his hands covered in what appeared to be chocolate. Mama, Papa, Rosa taught me how to make cookies. Well, mostly I just ate the dough, but she said that's the most important part. His innocent joy was such a stark contrast to the heavy emotions filling the room that both adults couldn't help but smile despite everything. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Did you remember to thank Rosa? Tommy nodded enthusiastically. She said I could help her make dinner too if you say it's okay. She's going to teach me how to make bread. He looked between his parents expectantly, and Margaret felt the weight of his trust like a physical thing. Of course you can help, Thomas said, his voice gentler than Margaret had heard it all day. But first, wash your hands. You look like you've been wrestling with a chocolate monster. Tommy giggled and held up his sticky fingers. Rosa said the same thing. She said I was going to attract every ant in the territory. He scampered off toward the washroom, chattering happily about his culinary adventures. When he was gone, the heavy silence returned. Thomas moved to the window, staring out at the landscape he had inherited and the responsibility that came with it. He's remarkable, he said quietly. Tommy, he's everything I could have hoped for in a son. Margaret felt a stab of pride mixed with fear. He's a good boy, she agreed. He deserves better than what I've been able to give him. Thomas turned from the window, his expression intense. You've given him everything that matters, he said firmly. Love, security, values. Do you think I care about his clothes or his education more than I care about the fact that he's happy, that he's confident and kind and brave, that he looks at the world with wonder instead of cynicism? His voice grew softer. You've raised him to be the kind of man I always hoped to be. Don't ever doubt that you've given him enough. The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. But now he can have more, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He can have his birthright, his father's name, a proper future. I won't stand in the way of that. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. What if I don't want you to stand aside? He asked quietly. What if I want you to stay, not just for Tommy's sake, but for mine? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning 5 years of separation and misunderstanding. Margaret felt her heart skip, felt hope begin to unfurl in her chest like a flower that had been too long in darkness. Thomas, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I know it's not that simple, he said. I know there are obstacles, complications. The town will talk, people will have opinions about our situation, but I don't care about their opinions anymore. I cared too much about them 5 years ago and it cost us everything. Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the possibility of happiness that seemed to be hovering just within reach. But she had learned to be cautious with hope, to protect herself from the kind of disappointment that could destroy what remained of her spirit. What about Tommy? She asked. People will call him a bastard. They'll treat him differently because of what we did. Thomas's expression hardened with determination. Not if he's legitimate, he said simply. Not if we're married. The words hit Margaret like lightning, illuminating possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. "Married," she whispered, not quite believing she had heard correctly. "Marry me, Margaret," Thomas said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of her. "Not because of duty or obligation or because Tommy needs a father. Marry me because I love you. Because I never stopped loving you, not for a single day in 5 years. Because when I saw you standing in that street this morning, desperate and proud and beautiful, my heart remembered what it felt like to be whole." Margaret stared up at him, seeing the sincerity in his dark eyes, feeling the warmth of his presence after so many cold, lonely years. "The scandal," she began, but Thomas shook his head. "Let them talk," he said fiercely. "Let them whisper and point and judge. I don't care. The only opinions that matter to me are yours and Tommy's, and I already know where he stands on the subject of having me as his papa." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Tommy appeared in the doorway again, his hands now clean but his face still bearing traces of chocolate around his mouth. "Are you talking about me?" he asked with the unerring instinct that children have for detecting when adults are discussing them. "Because Rosa said to tell you that dinner's almost ready, and she made my favorite, beef stew with lots of carrots." Thomas and Margaret looked at each other over their son's head, and Margaret saw her own hopes and fears reflected in Thomas's eyes. This was their chance, their opportunity to build the family that had been stolen from them by deception and misunderstanding. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, gossip, people who would never accept their unconventional beginning. But looking at Tommy's bright, trusting face, Margaret realized that some things were worth fighting for. "Tommy," Thomas said, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes, "how would you feel if your mama and I got married? If I became your papa for real and we all lived here together as a family?" Tommy's face lit up like sunrise, and he launched himself into Thomas's arms with a whoop of joy that could probably be heard in the next county. "Really? Really truly. We'd all live here together and I could ride the horses every day and help Rosa make cookies, and you'd read me bedtime stories like real papas do." The words tumbled out in a rush of excitement, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at the pure happiness in her son's voice. "Really truly," Thomas confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "If your mama says yes." Two pairs of identical brown eyes turned to Margaret expectantly, and she felt the weight of their combined hope like a physical thing. This was her moment of choice, her chance to step into the life she had dreamed of but never dared to hope for. Margaret looked down at her son's radiant face, then up at Thomas's hopeful eyes, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 5 years of suppressed longing. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tommy's whoop of joy echoed through the house, and Thomas rose to his feet, gathering both Margaret and Tommy into his arms in an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. But their moment of happiness was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, not the gentle clip-clop of a single rider, but the thundering hooves of multiple horses ridden hard. Thomas tensed, his protective instincts immediately alert. Through the window, they could see a cloud of dust approaching the main house, and as it cleared, Margaret's blood ran cold. Jake Morrison led a group of perhaps a dozen men, all of them carrying the grim expressions of a mob with a purpose. "Stay here," Thomas commanded, but Margaret was already moving toward the window to get a better look at their unwelcome visitors. She recognized most of the faces: shopkeepers, farmers, men who had once nodded politely to her on Sunday mornings but who now wore expressions of righteous anger. Behind them rode Sheriff Coleman, his star glinting in the afternoon sun, his face troubled but determined. "What do they want?" Tommy asked, pressing against his mother's side as he sensed the tension in the adults around him. Margaret's arms tightened protectively around her son as she watched Jake Morrison dismount and stride toward the front porch with the confidence of a man who believed he held the moral high ground. Rosa appeared in the doorway, her face dark with anger. "Mr. Thomas," she said urgently, "that Morrison man, he's been talking in town all afternoon, spreading stories, making accusations. He's got half the territory convinced that. She stopped abruptly, glancing at Tommy, clearly reluctant to speak the ugly words in front of the child. Thomas's jaw clenched as understanding dawned. "He's here to demand justice," he said grimly, "to protect the community from the scandal of a bastard heir and his immoral mother." The words were bitter on his tongue, but Margaret could see the steel in his eyes. This was Thomas Blackwood, the landowner, the man who controlled more wealth and power than anyone else in the territory. He would not be intimidated by a small-town banker and his mob of self-righteous followers. "Tommy," Rosa said gently, extending her hand to the boy, "come with me to the kitchen. I think those cookies need more testing, and this conversation is not for little ears." Tommy looked reluctant to leave, sensing the approaching storm even if he didn't understand its nature. But Rosa's warm smile and the promise of more cookies won out, and he allowed himself to be led away just as the heavy knock came at the front door. Thomas straightened his shoulders and moved toward the door with the measured stride of a man who had never backed down from a fight. Margaret followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had faced hunger, homelessness, and humiliation, but somehow this felt more dangerous than any of those trials. This was about more than her own survival. This was about Tommy's future, about the family they had just dared to dream of building. Thomas opened the door with calm authority, and Jake Morrison stepped forward with the pompous confidence of a man who believed he was doing God's work. "Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a prosecutor addressing a defendant, "we need to talk." Behind him, the assembled men murmured their agreement, their faces set with the kind of moral certainty that had justified countless acts of cruelty throughout history. "Then talk," Thomas replied evenly, making no move to invite them in. "But make it quick. I have better things to do than listen to whatever poisonous nonsense you've been spreading in town." Jake's face flushed at the dismissive tone, but he pressed on with the righteousness of a man who believed he held the moral high ground. "It's about that woman," Jake said, gesturing toward Margaret with undisguised contempt, "and the bastard child she's been passing off as an orphan. The whole town knows the truth now, Blackwood. We know what you did 5 years ago, and we know what you're planning to do now." His voice rose with each word, playing to his audience of assembled citizens. "This is a decent community, with decent families. We won't stand by and watch you make a mockery of Christian marriage by legitimizing your sin." Thomas stepped forward, and Margaret saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "Careful, Morrison," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're talking about my son and the woman I intend to marry. Choose your next words very carefully." But Jake was past the point of caution, drunk on his own sense of righteous authority and the approval of his followers. "You're bastard, you mean," Jake sneered. "Born in sin and shame, and now you want to compound that sin by marrying his whore of a mother." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Around Jake, some of the men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that he had gone too far, but others nodded their approval of his plain speaking. Thomas moved so fast that Margaret barely saw him strike. One moment Jake was standing there with his smug expression intact, and the next he was sprawled in the dirt with blood streaming from his nose. The assembled men tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Thomas faced them all with icy calm. "Anyone else have something to say about my family?" he asked conversationally. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. "Now, Thomas," he said carefully, "I understand you're upset, but assault is still assault, no matter who throws the punch." His eyes moved to Margaret, and she saw reluctant sympathy there along with his duty-bound determination. "And Morrison may be a pompous fool, but he's not entirely wrong about the situation. There are legal considerations here." Margaret felt her heart sink as she realized what was coming. Sheriff Coleman was a good man, but he was also an elected official who answered to the community that had sent this mob to Thomas's door. "What legal considerations?" Thomas demanded, though Margaret suspected he already knew the answer. "Well," Sheriff Coleman said uncomfortably, There's the matter of the boy's parentage. If he's illegitimate, then certain questions arise about inheritance, about the moral character of his guardians, about whether this is a suitable environment for a child. He paused, clearly hating every word he was forced to speak. The county has the authority to intervene in cases where a child's welfare might be at risk. The threat was clear, and Margaret felt her world tilt dangerously. They were threatening to take Tommy away, to use the circumstances of his birth as grounds for removing him from her care. Around Sheriff Coleman, the assembled men nodded their satisfaction. This was their real purpose, not justice, but power. The power to control the lives of those they deemed morally inferior. "You wouldn't dare," Thomas said, his voice carrying the full weight of his family's influence. "I have lawyers in San Francisco who would eat you alive in court. I have connections in the territorial government who would laugh at your pathetic attempt to interfere in my family's business." But even as he spoke, Margaret could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Legal battles took time, and in the meantime, Tommy would be vulnerable. Jake Morrison struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his nose with a handkerchief that was already stained red. "You think your money and your name make you untouchable," he spat. "You think you can flaunt decent society's rules without consequences. We'll see about that." He turned to address the crowd behind him, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. "This is about more than one man's sin. This is about the moral foundation of our community." Margaret stepped forward, her fear for Tommy overriding her instinct for self-preservation. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Don't punish my son for my choices. If you have grievances against me, then address them to me. But Tommy is innocent in all of this." Her words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment she thought she saw uncertainty flicker across some of the faces in the crowd. But Jake Morrison wasn't finished with his performance. "Innocent," he laughed harshly. "That boy is a living reminder of sin and shame. Every day he remains in this community is another day that decent children are exposed to the corruption of his example." His eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "The county has authorized me to take temporary custody pending a full investigation into his living situation." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, and she swayed on her feet. They were going to take Tommy away from her. After everything she had sacrificed, all the struggles she had endured to keep him safe and fed and loved, they were going to rip him from her arms because his father was a wealthy man, and his mother was a woman who had dared to love above her station. "No," Thomas said, and his voice carried such authority that even Jake Morrison stepped back. "You will not touch my son. You will not enter my property without a proper warrant signed by a territorial judge, and you will not threaten my family again." He moved to stand beside Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. "Now get off my land before I forget that I'm supposed to be a civilized man." But Jake Morrison had come too far to back down now. "Sheriff Coleman," he said, his voice shaking with rage, "are you going to let this man obstruct justice? Are you going to let him intimidate sworn officers of the county?" Sheriff Coleman looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between his official duties and his personal recognition that this mob was motivated more by malice than by any genuine concern for justice. "I have papers," Sheriff Coleman said reluctantly, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Signed by Judge Harrison this afternoon, temporary custody pending investigation." He held out the papers with obvious reluctance. "I'm sorry, Thomas, I truly am, but the law is the law." Margaret felt the world crash down around her as the full magnitude of their situation became clear. Judge Harrison was Jake Morrison's brother-in-law, a petty tyrant who wielded his authority like a weapon against anyone who crossed him. The papers might be legal, but they were born of corruption and personal vendetta rather than any genuine concern for Tommy's welfare. "How long?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow. "How long for this investigation?" Sheriff Coleman couldn't meet his eyes. "Could be weeks," he admitted. "Maybe months. These things take time to sort out properly." Behind him, Jake Morrison smiled with vicious satisfaction. This was his revenge for years of feeling inferior to the Blackwood family, his chance to bring down the mighty and make them grovel for mercy. "Papa, Mama," the small voice cut through the tension like a knife. Tommy stood in the doorway, his face confused and frightened as he took in the scene before him. Rosa hovered behind him, her own face etched with worry and anger. "What's happening? Why are all these men here?" His innocent question hung in the air, and Margaret felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She knelt down and opened her arms, and Tommy ran to her immediately, sensing her distress even if he didn't understand its cause. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered into his hair, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "Everything's going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel him being taken from her, could feel the future they had just dared to imagine slipping away like water through her fingers. Thomas stood frozen beside them, his face a mask of rage and helplessness. All his wealth and power meant nothing in the face of a corrupt system that had already decided their fate. Jake Morrison had won, and they all knew it. The only question now was whether there would be anything left to salvage when the smoke cleared and the battle was finally over. Tommy looked up at his mother with those dark eyes that mirrored his father's, and Margaret saw her own fear reflected in their depths. "Mama," he whispered, "are they going to take me away from you?" The innocent question cut deeper than any blade, and Margaret had to close her eyes for a moment to gather the strength to answer. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "No one is going to take you anywhere." But even as she spoke, Sheriff Coleman was stepping forward with obvious reluctance, his duty warring with his conscience. Jake Morrison stood behind him like a puppet master pulling strings, his bloodied face twisted with vindictive satisfaction. "You will not touch my child," Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority that made even Jake Morrison step back. "I don't care what papers you have or what corrupt judge signed them. Tommy stays with me." She pulled her son behind her, shielding him with her body as she faced down the crowd of men who had come to destroy her family. Thomas moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You heard her," he said quietly. "The boy doesn't leave with you. Not today, not ever." But Thomas just smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even Margaret's blood run cold. "You're welcome to try," Thomas said conversationally. "But I should mention that I've been expecting this visit. In fact, I've been hoping for it." His words sent a ripple of confusion through Morrison's group, and Margaret saw uncertainty begin to replace confidence on several faces. Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope, which he handed to Sheriff Coleman with the satisfied air of a man playing his final card. "That," Thomas said, "is a telegram from Territorial Governor Matthews, along with copies of several interesting documents that my lawyers have been investigating for the past few months. It says," Thomas announced to the assembled crowd, "that Mr. Morrison has been embezzling funds from the county treasury for the past 3 years. It says that Judge Harrison has been accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. And it says that both men are about to face federal charges for corruption and fraud." The words hit the crowd like a bombshell, and Margaret saw several men begin to edge away from Jake Morrison, as if his corruption might be contagious. Jake's face went from red to white to green as the implications sank in. "That's impossible," he stammered. But Thomas was already producing more documents from his coat, each one another nail in Morrison's metaphorical coffin. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of new riders. 4 men in federal uniforms rode into the yard with the calm authority of those who served a higher law than local corruption. Their leader dismounted and approached the group with official bearing. "I'm Marshal Davis," he announced. "I have federal warrants for the arrest of Jacob Morrison and Judge Harrison on charges of embezzlement, bribery, and conspiracy." The effect on Morrison's carefully assembled mob was immediate and devastating. Men who had been so eager to participate in the persecution of a widow and her child suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Within minutes, Jake Morrison stood alone as the federal marshals placed him in irons. Actually, Marshal Davis said conversationally, this investigation has revealed quite a network of corruption in this county. We'll be conducting a thorough review of all recent legal proceedings, including any custody orders signed by Judge Harrison. The relief that flooded through Margaret was so intense that she nearly collapsed. Tommy was safe. When the last of the unwelcome visitors had departed, an almost supernatural quiet settled over the ranch. Tommy looked up at his parents with wonder-filled eyes. "Are we safe now?" he asked in a small voice. Margaret knelt down and gathered him into her arms, holding him tight against her chest. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered into his hair. "We're safe now. The bad men are gone and they're never coming back." Thomas knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both Margaret and Tommy in an embrace that felt like a promise. "We're going to be married next week," he said, his voice soft but certain. "A proper wedding with the minister and the whole community invited." Tommy pulled back to look at both his parents with shining eyes. A real wedding, with a cake and everything. When they both nodded, he let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley. As the sun began to set over the Blackwood Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the three of them sat on the front porch watching the last light fade behind the mountains. Tommy dozed in Thomas's lap, exhausted by the day's emotions, while Margaret leaned against her future husband's shoulder and felt truly safe for the first time in 5 years. "No more secrets," Thomas said quietly, his lips brushing against her hair. "No more lies or misunderstandings or people trying to keep us apart. From now on, we face everything together." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Tommy stirred in his father's arms and mumbled sleepily, "I love you, Papa. I love you, Mama. I'm so happy we're all together now." His innocent words carried the weight of absolute truth, and Margaret felt her heart overflow with a joy so profound it seemed to light up the gathering darkness. They were home, all of them, finally, completely, irrevocably home.